And this is a Fox News alert. You're looking live at the White House, where the president's meeting with Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Speaker of the House John Boehner is now underway. Now, if they fail to reach an agreement tonight, the prospect of a government shutdown tomorrow night, well, that becomes all the more likely. And that prospect was hotly debated on the House floor earlier today. Let's take a look.
We don't accept the status quo.
We never shut down the government when we had the majority and President Bush was in power. And the reason, and I tell my friend, the reason we did not shut it down is because...
House will come to order. Gentlemen will suspend.
I would say let us look at why we are where we are to begin with.
But the question remains, when exactly do the Democrats plan to give up their talking points and actually get down to governing? Here to help answer that question, Democratic Congressman Pete Welch of Vermont. Congressman, how are you?
Good.
All right. Your party had control. This budget should have been passed October 1 of last year. The Democrats had control, significant majorities in the House, the Senate, you had the White House. For the first time since 1974, party in control fails to pass a budget. Explain to the American people why your party was derelict in their duty and didn't pass the budget.
Well, as you know, we made progress in the House, and then you have the filibuster rules in the Senate, and that was a huge impediment. The minority has a lot of power in our system.
There was no filibuster.
Well, they had to get the votes to do it. But the
point is,
you
had the majority.
Is,
pass it and then blame it on the Republicans. You guys didn't pass it.
Well, you know, we didn't, and we can stop and criticizing that. And we didn't pass it because there was incredible intensity about the cap-and-trade legislation, as it was called, the energy legislation, and about the health care bill.
Congressman, this is your first responsibility. This is Congress's job. You guys had power. You didn't pass a budget, and now your colleagues, and I don't know that you are demagoguing this. And don't you think Democrats ought to own up and stop blaming Republicans for the job they failed to do when they were supposed to do it?
Well, I do agree with that. I think we ought to be solving the problem. This is a practical problem to be solved, not an ideological battle to be won. I listened to Mike Pence. I agree with him about the urgency of trying to get our fiscal house in order. But there's two areas where I disagree with him and with Mr. Ryan, who, incidentally, I give a lot of credit for putting a serious plan on the table. It's what they don't put on the table that is going to handcuff us. Pentagon is exempt and revenues are exempt. And if you look at how we got here, the history of this, Bill Clinton, January 20, turned the keys of the White House over to George Bush, $5.7 trillion anticipated surplus. Then a decision by Mr. Bush, a war of choice in Iraq, $1 trillion. 2001, a tax cut at the high end, $1 trillion. 2003, $1.3 trillion in a tax cut. And then the Afghanistan war.
I got that.
No, listen, but
President
Obama
has been president. This is his debt, his deficit. You guys failed to pass a budget. All right, here we are. It's a $3.6 trillion. It's a $3.6 trillion budget. Republicans are saying cut $61 billion of $3.6 trillion. And we've got Debbie Wasserman Schultz saying this is a death trap for seniors. You got Harry Reid saying that Republicans don't want women to get cancer screening. And Nancy Pelosi saying Republicans are denying 6 million seniors dinner. Is that unfair? Are those accusations false?
Well, it's not particularly helpful for us to be using any of that language back and forth to solve the problem. We could get to the $61 billion. It'd be simple, all right? John Sullivan of Oklahoma had an amendment in the budget to get rid of the ethanol subsidy. That's like in the range of $15 billion. You add that to what's already there, and we're at that number. We could get the number, but if what we're doing is every time we come up with something that is getting rid of waste in the tax system, or we're saying, hey, let's take a look at the Pentagon, the two areas that have been major contributors to this deficit, and that's out of bounds, we're handcuffing ourselves from being able to reach agreement.
But let me argue this, because we're dealing with your budget that you guys didn't pass. Now there's scaring seniors, class warfare. This is spitting in an ocean, and Democrats are holding firm, and then they're demagoguing it. Now when we go to the 2012 budget, Paul Ryan is dealing with defense. Paul Ryan is doing what Barack Obama didn't do. He's dealing with entitlements, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. So I ask you, do you think President Obama punted and was unwilling to take a courageous leading position on the budget when he's had nearly $5 trillion in Obama debt since he's been president?
No, I'm not going to go down that road with you. I mean, I want to give Mr. Ryan some credit.
Right or wrong, though?
You're wrong. I mean, because you're erasing history. What did he inherit? When he came into office, Mr. Bush had transformed a $5.7 trillion surplus into a $10 trillion deficit. He faced the aftermath of the collapse of the banking system, where George Bush and John McCain were asking for $750 billion from the taxpayers to bail out the banks. We had unemployment of nearly 10%. Then we had a stimulus. And now we are in the midst of a fragile recovery. And I'll tell you something, this is where I do disagree with Mike. This shutdown, it's going to be inconvenient and painful for employees and for folks who need governmental services. But what we're playing with is the credibility of the United States and its ability and its political system to solve problems.
Congressman, your party failed in its key responsibility. Now you're scaring old people. You're demagoguing.
I'm not saying anything about it. I'm not doing that.
Nancy Pelosi, you're right. You're not. And I'm not inferring you are. But your party is. Nancy Pelosi is. Harry Reid is. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is. They're saying that old people will basically die and be forced to eat cat food. If we're going to compare budgets with the Bush administration, George Bush's budget deficit in 2007 was $161 billion. Barack Obama's budget deficit for February, 1 month, was more than that, 223. He has accumulated more debt than every president from Washington to Reagan combined. He's been president 2.5 years. This is not Bush's fault anymore.
That's pretty unfair when what you do is disregard what he inherited from the Bush years. But the bottom line here, and this is what I think is fundamentally important, this $61 billion number, we could get there today. Why is it that we won't go after the tax code? I'm talking about a provision that John Sullivan from Oklahoma, a Republican, introduced and passed to get rid of ethanol subsidies. That is just money out of the pocket of our taxpayers.
Listen, I don't care how. I will say this: the fact that the Democrats didn't do their job and now want to blame Republicans and scare old people, that's offensive to me.
I want to solve the problem. I'm not here to blame Republicans.
Well,
if we're going to solve the problem,
then your leaders need to stop scaring old people. And I'll tell you another thing: George Bush has not been president for nearly 2.5 years, Congressman. It's time for Democrats to man up and stop placing the blame, because Barack Obama's created this debt and deficit problem,
Sean,
not George Bush.
It's not about the blame, because it doesn't get us anywhere. It's about the policies.
You're blaming Bush.
If you want to solve the problem, no, I'm saying that if we're going to repeat the decision of the Bush years, where we exempt the Pentagon, and where we double down on tax cuts at the high end and shrink revenues that way, we're going to repeat history and make this worse. And in fact, in the Ryan budget, we go from about $15 trillion in debt in 10 years to $23 trillion in debt. That's the wrong way to go.
Paul Ryan is cutting $6.2 trillion. I have seen no Democratic plan. None, because the president doesn't cut anything. He increases spending yet again, another $1.65 trillion in debt this year, thanks to Obama's budget and reckless spending.
You always get the last word in. The bottom line here is that if we want to solve this problem, and we have to do it together.
All right.
We have to put everything on the table. That's the Pentagon, and that's revenues.
All right, Congressman, I do disagree, but at least you are not using that type of hyperbole, and I credit you for that. Thanks for being with us. Coming up next, as the budget battle continues, Donald Trump takes his fight to see President Obama's birth certificate to a whole new level. We're going to play clips of my interview with Donald Trump from earlier today, and also we are still awaiting. Any minute now, we hear that John Boehner and Harry Reid, their meeting with the president is coming to an end. Also, Vice President Biden was there, so did they strike a deal? Stay tuned. That's coming up next on Hannity.